Cyberpunk is a genre of first literature and then cinema that came about sort of in the 1970s, fully bloomed in the 1980s.
It's a dystopian world. It's a world that in some way involves some of the action being set in online worlds, cyberspace. There's often some kind of hacking.
A future that is dark, noirish, gritty, post-apocalyptic, also tinged with this Asiatic background.
Cyberpunk is perhaps better understood these days as more of a style than a particular genre or setting or even story type, because so much is depending on the sort of visual icons that have come to be associated with cyberpunk through film and gaming.
If you want to look at notable creators in literature, you have people like William Gibson.
Neuromancer is sort of the novel that epitomizes what everyone else was rushing to imitate.
J.G. Ballard or Philip K. Dick, even someone like William Burroughs.
And of course, Bruce Sterling set out a sort of cyberpunk manifesto. He's the one who coined the term. And so the cyber being linked with a kind of punk attitude, that's definitely something to be attributed to Sterling.
These are sort of authors who were dealing with changes in human relationships in the 60s and 70s that were spurred by the sexual revolution, and I think especially the drug culture, the idea of an investment in kind of psychedelic drugs, the idea of going inside of yourself, of discovering a new kind of interiority, of redefining the self, and especially the idea of this drug culture being a kind of counterculture that is antagonistic or some sort of threat to the established order.
Cyberpunk is seen as sort of celebrating a transcendence of the body for mind. Virtual spaces are more real or more meaningful than the material spaces, or one can live forever or become super intelligent in the virtual spaces. So sometimes they're seen as very much embracing that transcendence. Other times, I think the texts are seen as critiquing that fantasy. There's also ontological questions. How do we know what's real? Are we in reality? Is reality simulated? We might also think about questions of the mutability of the self. Is gender identity fixed? Is other kinds of online identities fixed? Do you have to have only one self for a body, or can you express the multiplicity of yourselves through different avatars? The setting obviously plays a huge part in these stories in the sense that virtual spaces being a main side of action, that's really the innovation of cyberpunk for science fiction.
There's often a space where you can kind of jack in and have a sort of virtual avatar version of yourself. And the question becomes, well, is that virtual avatar the same as you? What happens when your consciousness is liberated from the body? What does that say about the relationship between minds and bodies? Depending who's telling the story, the body can almost seem like a kind of impediment. You have this idea that it's the mind and it's the virtual space that is the free, liberatory, true space for human beings. Cyberpunk stories tend to create this parallel universe of the non-material.
There's always been a underworld criminal element in a lot of cyberpunk. This is sort of a lawless place where a lot of the old rules don't apply. What has been interesting to see is the role of the hacker, which does have a long lineage. In cyberpunk, usually the hacker is seen as sort of a heroic figure, a rebel, a figure who is trying to navigate this great unknown frontier and trying to restore some sense of order according to some code of ethics.
The protagonists of a lot of cyberpunk stories are hackers or outlaws. These are people who have a sort of deep investment in technology, who are trying to use that investment for anti-authoritarian ends. So these are the kind of archetypes you see. There's often characters who are completely virtual or robotic, who aren't really human in the way that we think of it. And also characters who are a kind of synthesis of human and machine, kind of a cyborg.
The plot itself in some ways is not that important though, but it's often more about these sort of adventures that happen, that there's a combination of virtual and material worlds. So the settings, I think, are as important as the storylines.
People often have the most fun with the setting and the mise en scene than they do with the stories a lot of time. Environments are a big part of the appeal because environments suggest the world in cyberpunk. It suggests something about the world that we're living in and about the intertwining of American and Asian interests and its future.
Asia was imagined as the sort of rising future, especially in 1980s cyberpunk. There's this sense that Asian cities are always like one technological generation ahead of other spaces.
It's kind of a mix in terms of Asian influences. Usually it's kind of superficial, where you'll see the future is always portrayed as Asian, but it's a very kind of strange Asianness in that it's orientalized as being pre-modern. So you don't think of a noodle stand as futuristic by any means, but what's it doing in Blade Runner, right? How is that supposed to be the future?
Can cyberpunk be labeled as culturally appropriative? Absolutely. There's clear appropriations from African American culture. There's clear borrowings from anime and manga. It's also creating this Orientalist imaginary. It's projecting a fantasy of what Asian cultures are through its fears of the relationship between Asia and the West into the future.
Another strong influence that came into the manifestation of cyberpunk was a lot of anxiety during the 80s with regards to how the West was positioned vis-a-vis the East. So there was a lot of economic uncertainty with regards to the US's global dominance. And you could see that manifested in a lot of cyberpunk's Asian aesthetics, portraying a future in which the East has already won in some regards.
The 1980s is also the beginnings of neoliberal economics, which have structured the world we live in ever since. And so the very dystopian futures of cyberpunk, the sense that futures will be run by corporations rather than governance, a huge gap between the extremely wealthy and the vast majority of people that are impoverished. And so in many ways, cyberpunk is sort of a fast-forward vision of the world as made by neoliberalism.
When cyberpunk was emerging as a genre, it was kind of predicting this corporate consolidation, this hegemony of tech corporations, this idea of kind of state technological surveillance. And cyberpunk was kind of an intervention to say, no, technology doesn't have to enslave us or sort of put us to work. Technology can be a way to oppose that before it becomes consolidated. Now, we live in an age where that consolidation is just taken for granted. So I think that the investment in cyberpunk stories is less like we can oppose these structures than hearkening back to a time where such an opposition was even conceivable.
Cyberpunk tends to be more dystopic in its vision, inherently pessimistic. You can connect that to the anxieties and the era through which it was born.
But like all good sci-fi stories, I think that imagined world is extrapolated from our present conditions. And these dystopias are usually corporate dystopias. And by that, I mean that sort of companies or corporate entities have displaced nation states as the major arbiters of power.
This domination of the future by capitalist corporate values, by profit, by growing economic inequality, that was leading to a dystopian future. There is an overall turn towards embracing sort of consumerism and excess that's typical of 1980s cultures, and that shows up in cyberpunk as well. The future is going to be increasingly urbanized, the future is going to be increasingly mediated, and that everything's going to be sort of high-tech and neon, and events will only take place at night seems to be your typical cyberpunk world.
Cyberpunk has become a genre with archetypes that you can draw from and play on, but I don't really think it has any sort of meaningful political salience. I think that we can go back to it again in this nostalgic way. We're saying, oh, here's where we actually had hope to oppose technological hegemony. I think to really be an oppositional force, you have to radicalize faster than the thing that is co-opting your aesthetic, and cyberpunk, at least in its mainstream sense, has not done that. If you look in real life, I think it's possible to view people like Edward Snowden or even Julian Assange, whatever you make of him, as sort of cyberpunkish figures who were oppositional figures that came from the sort of hacker culture.
The other place I'd say that cyberpunk has the biggest influence on pop culture today is really in terms of its style, through films and then through gaming that really are not part of the print tradition of cyberpunk. People wearing like leather jackets and biker boots, we'd call a kind of cyberpunk cosplay or something like that. I would say like style is really what most people think of when they think of cyberpunk, and not necessarily these more philosophical questions that were central to the original generation. We clearly live in a world where we realize that we could spend a lot of our lives online and in cyberspace, although it's a very, very different way of inhabiting cyberspace than cyberpunk initially suggested.
We We live in a cyberpunk world today only in the most boring way possible, where we can log on and jack in and do all this stuff, but only to sell our information to people who become richer because of it. One of the great tricks of capitalism is that it's able to sort of co-opt any sort of oppositional force and sell it back to the people who are initially opposing it. I think we live in a cyberpunk world in the sense that we see the dystopic version, we see the bad things that were predicted about cyberpunk, but I don't really see a lot of hero protagonists opposing that in any meaningful way.
What I've seen that's quite interesting now is there's been an embrace in the disabled community of prosthetics that don't look like human prosthetics anymore. But now you're seeing more and more prosthetics that are pretty radical, that highlight their artificiality, that embrace the cybernetic component of appendage of some kind. And so in that sense, you see the ideas and attitudes in cyberpunk influencing contemporary period in interesting ways.
Certainly, we live in a world that is entirely shaped by neoliberalism and globalized financialization, and those were extremely important to the emergence of cyberpunk. In terms of the sort of ethos of hacking culture that cyberpunk imagines, in terms of the prevalence of true autonomous AI as opposed to sort of smart systems that we live with, we're nowhere near the kind of vision that cyberpunk had. And then finally, I think things will probably, for many people, seem more like cyberpunk even into the future because of all the research being done on VR, immersive, and interactive entertainment.
In some ways, I'd say yes, we live in a cyberpunk world, but we're not quite there yet.